This is the story of Kish Air Flight 7170. On the 10th of February 2004, a Fokker 50 was flying from Kish Island in Iran to Sharjah Airport. The short flight was uneventful, and within 35 minutes, Flight 7170 was approaching Sharjah. At 11:24 a.m. local time, Dubai arrivals cleared the Fokker down from 9,000 feet to 5,000 feet. 5 minutes later, it was cleared all the way down to 2,500 feet and cleared for the approach to runway 12 at Sharjah. This was, for all intents and purposes, a very boring flight, but that was all about to change. They had excellent visibility that day and very little wind. The pilots flew the VOR approach to runway 12. In the cockpit, the captain handed the plane over to the first officer. The first officer had a very simple landing ahead of him. That too in great visual conditions and the best weather that you could ask for. But the first officer put the plane into a position where it was a bit too high for the landing on runway 12 at Sharjah. On top of that, the plane was a bit too fast. It should be configured for landing at this point, but it wasn't. The captain decided to take over control from the first officer. Another plane had been asked to line up behind Flight 7170. The pilot of that plane watched on as Flight 7170 flew its approach. Then, suddenly out of nowhere, the Fokker 50 turned sharply to the left and started to dive towards the ground. The plane spiraled to the left as it lost altitude very quickly. The pilots in the cockpit were trying their best to recover from the dive, but it was of no use. Within a few seconds, it was getting close to the ground and it was running out of altitude to recover. The plane impacted a vacant area and exploded into flames. The airport sent the fire trucks as soon as they could, and the locals helped with the rescue. But despite their best efforts, of the 46 people on board, only 3 people survived the crash. The case of Kish Air Flight 7170 is very strange. You had a beautiful day with great visibility, very little wind, and barely any weather phenomenon in the area. And all of a sudden, the plane just literally falls out of the sky for no apparent reason. No smoke, no fire, no nothing. The reason for this crash was logged in the cockpit voice recorder of the Fokker 50. The recorders were packed up and sent to France, where they were downloaded by the BEA. The story that the recorders had to tell was very interesting. The audio that they got from the recorders was great, but the recorder gave rise to more questions than answers, to be honest. The recording shed a light on few things that raised a few eyebrows. For example, the captain set the minimum descent height to 410 feet and not 500 feet as published. He asked the first officer to fly 118 degrees instead of 117 degrees published on the approach. These things were minor and in no way should have endangered the plane in the weather that they were in. They had amazing weather, so things like that should have been adjusted as the approach went on. But something really strange was happening in the cockpit. The captain wanted the first officer to take over the plane. That is nothing unusual. Captains do that all the time. But in this case, the first officer was hesitant. The first officer felt like he was not up to the task of flying the Fokker 50 into Sharjah under the most perfect weather conditions. He explicitly states that he does not have the experience that the captain does and wants the captain to fly the approach. The captain goes so far as to coach the first officer on how to fly the approach. The captain is very understanding. This makes no sense whatsoever. The first officer had more than 4,000 hours in the cockpit, of which 600 were in the Fokker 50. On top of that, he was even a captain on a C-130 for a while. Why this pilot is hesitant to fly a very simple VOR approach to a runway is beyond me and the investigators. This is why the plane was poorly configured for the landing. The first officer ended up putting the plane way too high and way too fast. The captain had to intervene to get the plane into the correct configuration for landing. Then, when the captain took control of the plane, something strange started to happen. The sound of the engines changed in a way that the investigators did not expect it to. Since the flight data recorder of the Fokker 50 did not record the throttle positions, The investigators had to use sound to understand what position the throttles were at. The BEA studied the audio from the cockpit to try and piece together what was happening in the cockpit during those final moments. To get a clearer picture of what was happening, they took another plane and recorded audio from its cockpit to see how the two audio sources compared. The audio analysis led to one thing. Someone in the cockpit had set the throttles into the ground control range while the plane was in flight. Now, let me explain what that means. On the Fokker 50 and many other turboprop aircraft, you can change the pitch of the propellers themselves. Depending on the angle of the blades, they produce more or less thrust. Think of it like this. When the angle is increased, the blades take a bigger bite out of the air and thrust increases. When the angle is decreased, not much air is moved and thrust decreases. But the thing is, the blades themselves are capable of a lot more angles, and not all of them should be used in the air. That's why the engine has mainly two settings, the flight control range and the ground control range. In the flight control range, the propellers can be between 15 and 45 degrees of pitch, and in the ground control range, the propellers can be between 15 and negative 17 degrees of pitch. As the name suggests, you're only supposed to use the ground control range on the ground as it generates a massive amount of drag. This is what's mainly used to slow the plane once it lands. If the propellers were to go in reverse when in the air, then the results could be disastrous, as it could really affect the airflow over the wings of the plane. It is so disastrous that the Fokker 50 had a lock built in to make sure that the pilots do not accidentally set the engines to the ground control range in flight. But despite all of those safeguards, the left-hand engine was set to the ground control range in the last few moments of flight. Now, there are a few ways by which the safety protections protecting the engines could be bypassed, thus allowing the engines to go into the ground control range. For example, the failure of the ground flight switches or some EMI disturbance all could theoretically remove protections that could send the engines into the ground control range. But in this case, that is not what happened. The audio analysis proved that someone in the cockpit, for whatever reason, set the left-hand engine into the ground control range, thereby allowing it to go into reverse. This is unheard of. No sane pilot would do this. As soon as the pilot did this, the left engine went into full reverse, and the right engine was in the ground control range, but was not at full reverse. This created an asymmetric thrust situation on the airplane, and it sent the plane into a left-hand spiral dive that the pilots could not recover from. The pilots in the cockpit apparently knew what they had done and pushed the throttles forward to takeoff power. But the thing is, pushing the throttles forward does not instantaneously take the propellers out of the ground control range. Depending on the aerodynamic forces acting on it, it can take a while for the blades to move back into the flight control range. In this case, the investigators think that the right-hand engine got back into the flight range before the left-hand engine. This is because the left-hand engine was at full reverse, and that's what caused the plane to go into the left-hand spiral that the pilots could not get out of. So, the question still remains, why did the pilots do this in the first place? As we established, the odds of this happening on its own without the intervention of the pilots is very slim to none. So, why? There were no discussions about this on the CVR, so we do not know which pilot did this. In a previous incident, a solenoid that was supposed to prevent the throttles from going into the ground control range failed, and that caused an accident. If you want me to make a video about that flight, drop a like on this video so that I know that you want more of this kind of content. But that wasn't the case here. The pilots may have intentionally set the engines into reverse as a way to quickly get the plane to slow down. Another theory is that when the captain took over from the first officer, it is possible that the first officer already had his hands on the throttles. In that case, the captain could have accidentally grabbed the ground control selectors, the switches that you would need to press in order to get the engines to go into reverse, by accident. Then the captain might have moved the throttles back thinking that he was setting the engines to flight idle. Why do you think the pilot set the engines to reverse in midair? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What I am interested in is the hesitancy of the first officer. This was a perfect day, and the first officer was more than enough experienced with 6,000 hours in the air to make a simple landing. Why did he tell the captain that he didn't feel up to the task of landing in such perfect conditions? Something does not add up here. Why do you think the first officer was so scared to fly the approach? The report says that it's a quote cultural or professional issue. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.